Hi everybody and welcome back. Now the 500mm f4 is a much loved lens for both sports and wildlife. This one, the 500mm f4 EFLED VR, was released in 2015 and that makes it the latest. And that was a time before the age of mirrorless, if you don't include the V1 and J1 series, so obviously it's an F mount. And since Nikon, for some unknown reason, haven't yet produced a Z mount 500, and I've already done the 400, it seemed vaguely logical to test the Z600 f4. Both f4, you see. Now, to be honest, I've been waiting to do these for a while, so I'd have used any excuse. So let's talk about costs. The 500 retails for about 11,000 and the Z600 for about 15,000. So I kind of need to be a bit careful with them, don't I? The 500mm is really light for a prime this size, and it uses a couple of fluorite lenses to keep the weight down. This one uses the same thing. Canon's been using that for quite a while, to be quite honest. Anyway, I must admit that I was expecting this to be bigger, but it's a really manoeuvrable size. There are a good selection of switches. There's manual autofocus, obviously, they will have that. There's full to or infinity to 8mm, not mil, meters. VR off, normal and sport. Memory recall. Sound on and off. Do you ever have your sound switched on? I certainly don't. And there's 4 function buttons. Now don't forget you can only use the one function. There are 4 so you can reach them easily depending on which way you have the camera around. There's a memory set on the flip side. Now I know a few photographers that swear by this lens, they absolutely love it, and I can't wait to see why. But first, let's have a quick look at the Z600. Now at £7 3 ounces or 3,200 grams, it's just a little lighter than the 200 to 400 that I tested back in March last year. Though strangely it doesn't feel anywhere near as heavy. It's got a built-in teleconverter that converts it to 800mm, that's f5.6, and I'll definitely be trying that. Now the switches are limited to manual autofocus and full to 10 meters as opposed to 8 meters on the 500. There's a LFN or lens function button and the same 4 function buttons that the 500 had. There's also a memory set. Anyway, I'm getting bored with all this. Let's get on and try them. Seeing as these size lenses are mostly used for wildlife, it seemed logical to make the first test from a hide. Okay, this time it was a new forest, and I've wanted to come here for ages. There's loads of opportunities for different birds, a reflection pool, and all in all, a great setup. The images I'm showing you are the original size and haven't been cropped at all. Now that's important because I also took my 300mm VR and my 100 to 400mm, my Z100 to 400mm I should say. I wanted to compare them to the other two, you see, and I think that the lens magnification is as important to this comparison, this test, as sharpness, handling, etc. Because having the right lens for the situation is key. I'm going to show you the images as I talk about how the lenses individually perform rather than discuss the images themselves. I'm going to let you make up your own minds about them. Personally speaking, I think they're pretty spot on. The only thing I'll say is I usually underexpose my nature photos and these are straight out of the camera. So the fact they're a little bit dark is no reflection whatsoever on the lenses. So firstly, the 500mm. Now the first thing I noticed was how noisy the focus is. It makes a real clonking sound, especially when it's going from long to short distance. And before you ask, yes, I checked that the VR was switched off, so it wasn't that. And on the subject of focus, quite often it can't seem to return from a distance of say 100 yards to 15 foot without manual assistance or frequent refocus button pressing. I'm going to test this in more detail later. For all of that, it's bright and clear through the viewfinder, and it's more than capable of producing some great shots. It's also got great in-focus hit rate. In other words, the amount of out of focus shots compared to in focus shots are minimal. Now, considering it still costs 11,000, it really should be that good, shouldn't it? Anyway, next it's the £15,000 Z600mm. I was advised that it may be a little bit too big for this hide, but I tell you what, I do like frame fillers, so I wasn't worried. The focal mechanism is much quieter in this lens. In fact, the only noise it makes is just a quiet whine. The whole process was far smoother than the 500mm. It's pretty quick, and about 95% of all the images taken were pin sharp. Now, that's pretty impressive with a lens this size. It's also beautifully bright to look through. The only thing that's a little bit clunky is the mechanism to switch to the converter, though it's not as noisy as the Z400 f2.8 that I tested last year. At 800mm, focus seems a little bit more hit and miss, even on a gimbal. Take the aperture up to f7 or f8, however, and I found a real sweet spot. Virtually every shot was now in focus, and the 800mm still blurred the background beautifully well. It's a bit overkill though, to be honest, for what I was doing. That said, the Z100 to 400mm, well, going back to 400mm after 800 seemed a bit of an anticlimax, mainly because I was getting used to real frame fillers. And when you're in a hide, the distance between you and the subject is pretty much fixed. On the upside though, it gave me some different images that were just as good. Now the 300mm VR, my favourite lens. Now if I thought that the 400mm was a little inadequate for what I was photographing, I experienced a very unpleasant feeling. Disappointment in my 300 VR, my favourite lens. Not because the images it produced aren't sharp, and not because the focus is slower. No, those are still outstanding. It was the size of the subject through the viewfinder. I guess yet again I had to be a bit imaginative. Before I arrived, I was advised that a 300mm to 500mm lens would be best to use. What I didn't read was that the 300mm would be the preferred lens for cameras with a crop sensor, and the 500 lens with full frame. So I guess the fault was entirely my own. Anyway, halfway through the day I swapped the 500 and the 600mm lenses between cameras to see if it made any difference to especially the 500mm focus. So that 500mm now went on the Z9 and the Z600 to the Z8. The 500mm definitely focused better when it was on the Z9, and the 600 didn't focus quite as well with the Z8, oddly. It actually cost me a couple of photo opportunities. Yeah, but it's absolutely usable. Don't get me wrong. It's a great combination still. I'm just being really fussy. I'm being nitpicky. Both cameras were set to bird detection from the start of the day. And as I thought both cameras had the same focusing system, it's confused me a lot, to be quite honest with you. All in all, it was an interesting and informative day. I now feel like I know the two lenses one heck of a lot better. Anyway, now as Jessica says, there are tons of YouTubers testing equipment on birds, so I really needed to do something different. For now, how about cricket? Now this is not a subject I've photographed before, but as it turned out, it's great fun. I'm not normally a cricket fan, I must admit, but it's actually a very photogenic sport, and as long as you can shoot from the correct angles, it's pretty rewarding. Freezing the action with the Z9 and Z8 isn't the problem. It's capturing the batsmen's faces that seems to be the trickier part. And as it turned out, both the 500mm and the Z600 lenses were pretty perfect for the job. Now, during the match, I used a monopod to A, steady the lenses while I took the shots, and B, save my poor old arms by taking the weight of those lenses. And whilst we're talking about weight, I've just realised that I didn't tell you the weight of the 500 VR. Well, it's 3,090 grams, that is, whilst you already know the 600 is slightly heavier at 3,200 grams. Now that difference is negligible really. It's about the size of a deck of cards or a small guinea pig. The length of both lenses was just about perfect for cricket, as I've said. And that's because I was a fair distance away from the action. The umpire had told me that I could stand wherever I wanted, as long as it wasn't in front of him. But I did decline his kind offer and didn't cross the boundary line. Now this is partially because it obviously didn't seem right, and partially because of my own safety, but mainly because I really couldn't imagine a conversation starting with, "I'm afraid your £15,000 lens was smashed by a cricket ball," could ever end particularly well for me. Anyway, while I've been waffling, you've been watching a selection of the photos from the Z600. And as you can see, they are sharp. However, when I flicked over to the teleconverter, I wasn't as impressed. Now bear in mind that I was using that monopod and a ridiculously fast shutter speed. The 840mm teleconverter seemed to be frequently a little bit soft. Now don't get me wrong, some images were perfectly okay, but for me it was just too inconsistent, I'm afraid. So let's take a look at the photos from the 500mm. Once again, it captures the action with ease. They appear to be sharp, crisp, and show no distortion whatsoever. I cropped in about the same amount as the Z600 pictures in editing, but just as that Z600, other than a little bit of shadow and highlight adjustments, they're pretty much untouched. Both lenses felt comfortable and balanced on the monopod, and I felt the 500 allowed me to show more of the story, whilst the Z600 definitely made me want to isolate the individuals and then fill the frame with them. I guess it's comparison time again, so once again I've randomly chosen some images that are pretty much alike. Then I've cropped them in to have a little pixel peep. I think the 500 is a little sharper, but the Z600 appears to be cleaner. Let's check the next pair. This time I think the Z600 has it, and the 500 is once again a little bit more noisy. Interesting, because for those images I was using an aperture of 1250, whereas the Z600 was 1600. So it's not that then. Now to the last comparison, and if you're thinking, hold on now, surely you'd need to crop in more with a 500 than with the 600, your wish is my command. So what do you think? It's close, isn't it? And just to throw a curveball into the mix, I also took my Z100 to 400 as a further comparison. The lens allows for some great panoramic style images, but to be honest, 400mm isn't quite long enough for individual shots. Just look how much I've had to crop in from the original. It's the same with all the photos that I took with the 100 to 400 at 400mm. I remember when I thought the 400mm was a decently large lens, but for this it's just not quite big enough. On the upside, the images you get from it and the Z8 are so good that you can crop it in considerably. Nothing wrong with that. And this is how much I cropped in by. Here's another that you've already seen. Let's zoom in. And the quality is pretty impressive, isn't it? When you crop in that much. And here's the extent of that crop. So all in all, you've seen the images from the hide, you've seen the images from cricket. That's nature and sport done. All that's left is to show you the focus speeds and accuracy through the camera using my Atomos Ninja. But before we get into it, I'd better give my new viewers a quick explanation. From my position with the camera, I'm going to focus on 3 trees. Number 1 is the closest at 4.5 meters or 15 foot. Number 2 is to the right and is 10 meters or 33 foot away. The third tree is 50 meters or 165 foot away. I'll be following the same pattern and timing with all lenses, and I did this test about a month ago when it was still summer. So I'm a great believer in starting with what you know. So I'm using the 100 to 400mm because I know how fast that focus is, and I think it would be a good starting point and comparison point. I'm using single spot focus, and I'll be aiming for the light patches of all three trees. The reason I've got an ear pod in my ear is because I'm actually listening to myself, counting myself down to each one, because that's how I do these. So in a minute I will get started. Right. You of course will be able to see what I'm doing because I'm going through the Atomus. Okay, I'll look at those and give you the average one. As per usual, it seems to me that the Z9 in particular doesn't like going from far to very close. It's its weak point, if you like. It goes from close to far very, very well. So how much is that the Nikon and how much is that the lens? Who would know? We'll test it with our lenses, and if it's a constant problem, then we know, don't we? Okay, swap the lens. Okay, continuing the theory of what do you know, I'm now using the 300mm. So let's have a look. Okay, now we start with the unknowns. This is the 500. Yes, it's taking 2 double taps. Yes, it struggles again with the far to near. And I wish you could hear how clunky this. I don't know whether you can actually hear it or not, but it's very, very clunky. Yes, it can't even find the near that time. Let's give it one last go. Yep, can't focus it. Interesting, yeah. Now I guess we've got to take into account that I'm using the converter and it's a lens not designed for the Z9. I need to be as kind to it as possible. I've got to say, I love the rubberized grip on the underside of the foot. Makes it really comfortable to carry. Now this is a 600. Right, one last go with the 600. Struggling again far to near. Actually struggling more with mid to near. You notice I'm focusing on different things. Okay, let's crank it up to 8. Let's see how we get on. I expect this to make it worse. Or not, at the very least, not do it any favours. Yes, I'm now having to aim for different parts of the leaves. Well, that went better than I expected, because at 840mm the focus performance was more positive than at 600mm. Who'd have guessed? Anyway, you want my conclusion? Well, the bokeh from both lenses is gorgeous, and I found that the maximum aperture of f4 was easily enough for the light that I had and the ISO and the shutter speeds that I was using. I thought the focus capabilities were pretty similar, and as I use both lenses on either a gimbal or monopod, as you will probably do, any small weight difference was irrelevant, to be honest. I'd love to have had both lenses for longer than a couple of days, but I tell you what, they were just about enough to make a decision. And my favourite lens for both cricket and wildlife was the Z600. Not just for that extra reach compared to 500mm, and not just because of the sharpness at that magnification. But to quote a top presenter, it's just a really nice place to be. I felt really at home with it. The lens feels modern and slick, whereas I have to say, despite the quality of the images it produces, the 500mm VR does feel like old technology. Just a tad clunky, maybe a touch agricultural. Having said that, if you've got one, I'm still pretty jealous. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and if you like this video, then please like it, and if you really liked it, then you know what to do, subscribe. And if you've subscribed already, thank you so much, it means a lot to me. Until next time, bye.